Everybody, and welcome to the Chartered Institute of Environmental Health. Particular welcome, not only to the people in the room, but particular welcome to people logged in online who are seeing this as a webcast. We've got somewhere the order of 60-odd people pre-registered as of yesterday, so hopefully as many of them as possible are now looking at this and tuning into it. And I hope it doesn't spoil your tea if you're sat at home. Or I hope it maybe enhances your glass of wine if you're sat at home. And if you're sat at home, can I just ask you, please feel free to join in. You have the option, certainly via your screen, of asking questions. And I would hope that you're able to contribute by asking questions at the appropriate time. And the same is true, obviously, for everybody sat in the room. The format of this evening is largely, we're borrowing from the BBC's Question Time, with a slight modification in as much as we've got a panel of speakers here to at least make some initial remarks to get things going. And once they've had the opportunity to say what they want to say, then you have the opportunity, and that includes everybody at home, to say what you would like to say or to ask what you would like to ask. So please feel free to engage, and the discussion that follows will go as long as there are questions. I can tell you that we've already got some questions, and before you ask, no, they're not planted. We've got some questions from members of our air quality community and advisory panel, and they were emailed in to us throughout today. And if things reach a little bit of a slack point, they will come out, and we'll ask some of those anyway. So this is about being interactive and for you, giving you the opportunity to talk to the great panel of speakers that we've got here. Before I introduce those as individuals, I do want to thank them all collectively and individually for giving up their time this afternoon, this evening, and for coming in. We really, really appreciate it. And you're coming in, as all of you are, including the audience at home, to an event that is about air quality. It's about air quality because today is World Environmental Health Day. We are in the Chartered Institute of Environmental Health in Hatfields in London. We are part of the larger global environmental health community, and that larger global environmental health community are all contributing around the world to World Environmental Health Day, and we're all contributing on a single theme, and that single theme is air quality. So wherever you are, whether you're in Australia, whether it's New Zealand, whether it's Malaysia, Hong Kong, Africa, there will be colleagues out there contributing to today in terms of running events, running presentations, running parties in some instances around the general theme of air quality in World Environmental Health Day. So that's what we're here to do. I hope this is going to be a very frank conversation. Please feel free to pretty much say what you like, bearing in mind, however, this is going live out to the internet. So obviously there are some obvious constraints. But in respect of that, let me get round to our panel. We've got four interesting panellists that will hopefully spark some debate. I'll begin with the first on my right, on your left. Yeah, your left. Professor Jim Longhurst. Professor Jim Longhurst, I've known for a good many years, far too many years. Jim is Professor of Environmental Science and Assistant Vice-Chancellor for Environment and Sustainability at the University of England. He's got 30 years of experience of research, leadership, specialising in air quality and carbon management. His research has been funded by a wide range of national and international sources, and he's published extensively in peer-reviewed literature and is co-chair and editor of the annual Air Pollution Conference and Proceedings. His national roles include Vice President of the UK Institution of Environmental Sciences, Honorary Vice President of Environmental Protection UK, and Director of the Bristol Green Capital Partnership. He's advised national and local governments in the UK and overseas on air quality management policy and practice. So hope you will recognise that we've got an excellent speaker in Jim to kick things off in a moment. On the other side of Jim, we've got Bridget Fox. Bridget is a sustainable transport campaigner, and she works on roads policy, clean air, low carbon transport and related issues on behalf of the Compaign for Better Transport, where she came to from a leading planning public affairs agency where she was account director working on new homes and renewable energy. Prior to that, Bridget had a long career as a project manager in library and information technology, as well as serving for 8 years as a front bench councillor with a transport and environment brief. She's a board member of the European NGO Transport and Environment. Bridget is a lifelong campaigner on environmental issues, from opposing gravel pits to introducing recycling schemes and improving road safety. And in 2006, won a National Transport Award for her local campaign work. Bridget joined Compaign for Better Transport at the end of 2015. To the other side of Bridget, we've got Roger Geffen. Geffen's involvement in cycle campaigning began as a volunteer with the London Cycling Campaign in the late 1980s. He soon branched out into other transport and environment groups, including anti-road campaigns in the mid-1990s. With the subsequent shift in national transport policy, Roger took a Master's in Transport at London University and began working for Oxfordshire County Council on walking, cycling and local transport policies. After a spell with consultant Steer Davies Gleave, Roger joined Cycling UK, where he is at the moment, as campaigns and policy manager, and he is now their policy director. Roger was awarded an MBE for services to cycling in 2015. And last but by no means least on the panel, we've got Matt Clark. Matt Clark is an environmental health practitioner, and after graduating from the University of York in biology in 2005, Matt worked in university plant laboratories until 2007. A change of career took him out of the lab and into hotels and restaurants, where he's held positions ranging from bar manager before environmental health called, and he completed his MSc in environmental health at the University of Derby in 2010. Since that time, Matt's worked for Shropshire Council, where his current focus is air quality. And he's the single point of contact for all planning application consultations that public protection receive. So we've got an interesting panel, a nice balance of the people here. And at that point, I'll invite Jim to kick us off and to make an opening statement from his position. And then we'll move on, obviously, through Bridget, through Roger, and to Matt. And then I'll resume the podium and act as MC in relation to questions. Okay? So, Jim Longhurst, thank you.
Well, thank you, Tony, and thank you, CIEH, for organising this event today. This is World Environmental Health Day. We should celebrate that fact, the fact that we are here and that there are people online listening to me is testament to the reach of the CIEH. And so thank you for pulling this together, because this is a really serious issue. This has been described as a global public health emergency. It's been described as a UK public health emergency. So I thought I would just start with some context. The WHO, the World Health Organization, estimates something like 3.7 million deaths due to ambient air pollution in one form or another. 3.7 million, I have no idea what that looks like, but it is a huge number. But we find it quite difficult to deal with a number in a sort of abstract sense. But those are real people whose death is brought forward, is premature because of choices their society and global society has made. If we just turn our attention to Europe, The estimate is that something like 500,000 people have their lives ended prematurely because of exposure to ambient air pollution concentrations. About 6.5 million people suffer illness each year, according to WHO's Air Quality Management Centre in Berlin. 6.5 million. That's the population of some of the smaller EU countries. And the centre in Berlin estimates that something like 4 billion euros of health costs, 4 billion euros of health costs are associated with those illnesses. And lost work days may be as much as 16 billion euros. Within the EU, a large percentage of the population are exposed to air pollution that exceeds the WHO's air quality guidelines, and 24 out of the member states of the European Union exceed the mandatory air quality standards for one or more pollutants. And more than 130 cities find themselves in that position across the European Union, and many small towns and other settlements. In the UK, the estimate of deaths is somewhere in the region of 40,000, although COMEAP, the Committee on the Medical Evidence of Air Pollution, is revising their thinking on the effect of NO2. We don't know where they will settle. I understand there is a healthy debate going on within that organisation. They will settle out on a number. But at the moment, the number is 40,000, including particulate matter. Now, that is a very large number. It's 4 times the size of the town I grew up in, and I can visualise that number. In the city I live in, Bristol, the estimate is somewhere in the region of 250 to 300 deaths brought forward due to air pollution concentrations. That's just PM and nitrogen dioxide. Those are translatable into something like 5 deaths a week associated with air pollution in a city that is recognised as probably being the most livable city certainly in England, if not in the United Kingdom. So these are very serious, and it's hardly a surprise to us. We have known for many, many years that nitrogen dioxide was an intractable pollutant. It wasn't responding to the management that local authorities were exercising under their local air quality management duties. Something like 67% of all local authorities have one or more air quality management areas. You in the room and watching digitally will know that this is a serious and long-standing problem. They were meant to have been dealt with by 2005, when the national objective for nitrogen dioxide would have been achieved everywhere within the United Kingdom. And here we are, 12 years later, and there are ever more local authorities with air quality management areas. Now, the really sad thing is that the political will at national and local level has never been exercised in such a way that these issues can be dealt with. It is not impossible to deal with these issues. It requires political will and the organisation of the decision-making of our society to prioritise public health and to deliver society the benefits of organised public health protection. And we, if we are serious about this, are failing in that duty. If 40,000 deaths per annum are occurring because of air pollution in some form or another, then we are not dealing with the responsibilities that a government and local authorities should take as their first priority, the protection of public health. And I think this is a scandal. I am surprised it has taken so long for us to arrive at a position where public health emerges to the forefront of the agenda. To turn, though, to the NO2 roadside plan, as it is now called, it is weak, it is inefficient, it will not deliver any of the rapid benefits that are required. It is a plan for a plan, according to one of the respondents to the consultation, and the The excellent air quality bulletin published by Jack Pease has summarised many of the responses, and the pretty scathing commentary: we are not taking public health protection seriously. We are not doing what we should be doing as a society to protect public health. And if we just ask a very simple question, who is most exposed? Well, probably the already ill, the very young, and the poor. And if a society wishes to call itself a society, it should focus its efforts on protecting those more vulnerable individuals. I ask the question, are we really doing that? And if we are, where is the evidence? Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Bridget, let me just bring this, tee you up,
Thank you very much.
and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you to everyone who's here to listen, and thank you to the CIEH for having me as one of your guests this evening. It's very important, and as we've heard, topical event. All the participants were asked to say what our organisation's position was on this issue, and the position of Compaign for Better Transport is quite simple. We believe that everyone has the right to clean air. And as we've heard, that shouldn't be a big ask, certainly not in a modern country in the 21st century, and yet it's still not something we've yet managed. What, might you say, is the interest of a transport organisation in this? And Compaign Better Transport, older viewers may remember it as Transport 2000, when 2000 was still in the future. For a quarter of a century or more, we've been championing sustainable transport solutions, better public transport, walking, cycling, active travel, long before air pollution was a thing. But of course, if we're going to solve the problems of air quality, then we need to clean up Transport's Act. Because I'm sure you all know, we've heard the scale of the problem, but the source of that, by and large, is transport. 80% of the NOx roadside or in urban areas, most of which is roadside, comes from transport. If you live downwind from a coal-fired power station or you work on a plant using diesel generators, your exposure may be slightly different, but for most of us, most of the time, transport's the problem, and diesel vehicles in particular. And the problem goes further because even the newest diesel vehicles, this is the Dieselgate scandal you'll all have heard of, are performing worse on the road than they do in the lab. So even if on paper they are compliant with the latest standards, in practice they're breaking them, which may explain why all those air quality management areas have failed to deliver. How can you do it when the vehicles which are causing the pollution are basically lying by sins of omission or commission about the amount of pollution they are contributing? And while I'm here, I might say that cleaning up motor vehicles is also critical to our other crisis issue where we're off track, which is cutting CO2 emissions. And many of the solutions to air quality also help with the challenge of CO2. Well, we too have been critical of plans for plans for plans. It's a bit like buses, isn't it? We spent years bemoaning the fact the government didn't have a plan. And then we've had 3 in 18 months or less. But we've joined the criticisms. We're part of the Healthy Air campaign along with allies on the platform, and our response said that the plans were, as you can see, wholly inadequate, not fit for purpose. And those are the bits which, guided by Tony's words, I've made family friendly. We had some harsher criticisms too. We did think the Clean Air Zone guidance wasn't bad. It was quite a long menu of things you could do, but it was a menu without prices and also a menu without a budget. And we've criticised the plans for making charging zones, which the evidence base the government drew on acknowledged are the most effective way to cut emissions as being a last resort. No scrappage schemes, no powers to ban diesel. And missing some big things that we've been calling for. A new Clean Air Act sets the common benchmarks and resource them. Environmental justice, a policy based, as we've heard, on the principle that the polluter pays. And a policy that delivers fewer cars, not just newer cars. The good news is there's lots we, and by we I mean you, can do right now. The picture shows a street in Camden, one of their school streets projects, where they've banned motor vehicles with both 4 wheels and 2 from the street at school pick-up and drop-off times. Any measure you take that prioritises walking and cycling over motor vehicles will help, even if it's on a street-by-street level. We need to plan for fewer, greener cars. I mentioned that we want fewer as well as newer, but newer are definitely part of the solution. Obviously, electric vehicles are zero emission at roadside. How clean they are depends, of course, on where their electricity is generated. And there's a certain amount of attrition on the grid. So local generation from sustainable modes is always better. And there are challenges with getting cars charged up, because curbside, particularly in urban areas where the problem is greatest, is at a premium, as you'll all know. But we've got some solutions. We think use the planning system to make better provision for electric vehicles, make it a requirement for new developments over a certain size that they provide publicly accessible off-street electric vehicle parking. The picture shows a council-owned housing estate car park in Tower Hamlets, where they've made electric charging points available. Partner with car clubs. Car clubs need local authorities' help to have parking spaces on the road or on new developments. Why not require them to be all electric? And you can help deliver the fewer cars agenda by using your planning policies to locate homes in where they will be and jobs where they will be less car dependent. And making rational and rationed use of parking and road space, although not always politically easy, is inevitably going to be part of the solution. And one cracking example of this, which I won't run through in detail, but I commend to you, is the workplace parking levy. I don't know if there's anyone here or watching from the city of Nottingham. Nottingham's won an Ashton Award for this amazing scheme, but the powers have been there since 2000. So really we say get on and do it. It's a small, modest charge, works out about £1 per space per year, levied on larger car parks at workplaces. Employers can choose whether they pay the charge or pass it all or some of it on to their employees. And Nottingham's reinvested the revenue in better public transport, so it's had huge economic and social benefits. Modern public transport, that's what we're in the business of advocating at Compaign for Better Transport. Rail electrification has been in the news, but there's lots you can do with buses too. Euro 6 buses, much cleaner than Euro 6 cars, and of course they replace lots of cars on the road. And if you're going to have a retrofit or scrappage scheme, buses are much better value for taxpayers' money than helping people upgrade their private cars. And we need to do something about deliveries. A huge growth of the amount of traffic on our roads is moving goods, not people. It's part of our love affair with online shopping and also the way modern national retailers work. But the stuff we can do here nationally to encourage use of better rail freight and as planning authorities to make space for rail freight interchanges, and locally with smarter last mile solutions. Again, a London example in Regent Street. The different retailers there share a low emissions van for their last mile from a shared consolidation centre further out in London, so that Liberty Scarves and Hamleys Teddy Bears share a single low emission van to get to the shop. And there are lots of scalable solutions for towns and cities, including things like encouraging the use of pick-up at local shops, local train stations, so people have the convenience, but it takes many more vehicles off the road. Lots more where that came from. I just want to reassure you that not only is this a critical problem that we do need to address, but some of the tools for addressing it are already in our hands. And if you want to know more about how we can advise on those and others policies, these are our contact details, and I'm also hoping to get some good ideas from all of you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Bridget. Turning to Roger Geffen, Policy Director for Cycling UK. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Tony, and thank you to everyone here and at home or in your workplaces, wherever you are, for being here or in metaphorically or physically. As I say, this is a huge issue. I think the previous speakers have both outlined the scale of the problem. I should actually have just brought up with me. We do have a briefing which provides a whole load of the facts and figures that amplify the case for seeing cycling not. There is a tendency to see cycling or cycle facilities or cyclists as part of the problem, so that's why I just thought I would just have a look at the flip side to this debate before setting out our position on how we see cycling as you will probably guess from my title that I do actually see cycling as the solution to the problem. But let's start by introducing us. So we've been around since 1878. It's sometimes said that some of our 64,000 members have probably also been around that long. Cycling is incredibly good for your life expectancy. I will touch on that in a moment. We have a range of cycling activities, local groups going out for bike rides, recreational bike rides. We support our members with magazine, legal services, insurance, and so on. We have campaigners, we have local volunteers around right through the UK, working to persuade decision makers to do more to create the conditions where more people will cycle. And we also run practical projects. We don't just shout about it. We got our hands dirty, and we are out there. We have field staff offering people the opportunities, whether people from with health conditions which can be treated by getting people cycling, people from disadvantaged communities, a whole range of projects to get people into cycling, particularly from groups who are not the usual suspects of cycling. So that's us. I want to just pick up on one of Bridget's points, which Bridget rightly made, is the need to see air quality not just as an issue in isolation, but as one that where the solutions to air quality are linked to many of the other problems. This graph was a key graph that came from a Cabinet Office report done in 2009, and what it's basically saying is that it was an analysis of transport problems in English urban areas. And in essence, what that's saying is that there are four big issues, and others, well, actually, I think that they've probably underestimated the costs of greenhouse gas emissions. There are all sorts of problems with the methodologies of costing the disbenefits of greenhouse gas emissions. But the four that come to the top of that pile are congestion. They use the word accidents. I don't like the word accidents. I prefer injuries or casualties. I won't go into that debate. But air quality and physical inactivity. All four of those problems were costed in 2009 by the government as being of the order of 10 billion. If we merely tackle the air quality problem, we're only talking about a quarter of the problem that they documented at that time. And as I say, there are other problems. There is a really important link with climate change, which actually, in terms of cost-benefit methodologies, it tends to get underestimated because of the difficulties of quantifying the benefits or the disbenefits of greenhouse emissions for future generations. But the point is that I think the point still stands, using the government's own data. We need to tackle all four problems. We need to look at this as an opportunity to tackle all four problems. If we merely go, as Bridget says, for cleaner cars, not for newer cars, not fewer cars, I really like that phrase, then we are only effectively tackling a quarter of that problem. So, is cycling, are cyclists the victims rather than part of the solution? Well, there's plenty of good evidence documented in this briefing I touched on earlier, which says that actually, despite the pollution risk and indeed the injury risks, cycling is good for your health, it's good for your life expectancy. Overall, you can expect to live 2 extra life years. And in fact, it has been found that Cycling UK's own members have an average life expectancy 2 years above the population average. So join Cycling UK, get 2 extra years on your life expectancy. And we can reference that. It's all in the briefing. It's all in the briefing. There's also good evidence, but not absolutely conclusive evidence, that cyclists breathe in less pollution than people inside motor vehicles. There is some counter-evidence to that one. It may depend on how fast you're cycling and therefore how deeply you're breathing and how that affects some of the particulates. And that has led to a bit of a debate as to whether the solution to the problem is to steer the cyclists away from the main roads, which is something that NICE said rather unhelpfully, or whether actually the whole point is cycling. In order to create the conditions where more people will cycle, we need to be reallocating road space on those main roads based on the fact that cyclists actually use road space incredibly efficiently. A typical lane of a typical road can carry 2,000 bicycles per hour, 2,000 cars per hour or 14,000 bicycles per hour. In other words, reallocating road space towards bicycles is part of the solution. So that brings us on to the Daily Mail headlines. there was me. I've thought in sort of the time I've been doing this, there I have been advocating cycling as part of the solution to pollution. And then suddenly the Daily Mail and others started saying that actually cycle facilities, all these new cycle superhighways, they're causing congestion, they're causing pollution. And we've had MPs and peers echoing that sentiment from the Daily Mail. Well, as I say, cyclists use road space very efficiently. Transport for London has produced very good data that the roads where they've introduced cycle superhighways are already carrying more people than they could possibly have done under their previous road layout. But the emphasis is on more people rather than more vehicles. Because there is a bit of a wrinkle in this argument. In the short term, in some circumstances, you will see more congestion in a very localised sense for the motor vehicles. However, over time, the road network as a whole will enable more people to get around, and therefore it will reduce congestion overall. It's one of those slightly counterintuitive things. It's actually the opposite of what happens when you build a new road, a new bypass, such as the Newbury bypass. In the short term, that will reduce some congestion in the immediate vicinity of the road, but it'll generate more traffic, and therefore over the network as a whole and over a longer time period, typically around 10 years, according to some research that Compaign for Better Transport commissioned that, wasn't it? That was CPRE's research, yes. That over time, it will generate more traffic and therefore will generate extra congestion over the network as a whole. Reallocating road space will do the opposite. It might generate some extra congestion in the immediate vicinity in the short term, but over time it will allow the road network to function more efficiently, therefore will reduce congestion and will reduce pollution over the road network as a whole and over time. And what really strengthens that point about over time is that each link in the network, in a cycle network, becomes more efficient the more links you add to that network, the more comprehensive the cycle network becomes. Each new link adds to the cycle use on the existing links. And therefore, the current cycle network in London, because it's still only very fragmentary, it's still massively underperforming compared to how efficiently it will function when it's a more comprehensive network. So, the Daily Mail argument may work in the short term, and incidentally, it's noticeable that they always pick on the East-West superhighway, the section along the embankment, which happens to take you to the Houses of Parliament and happens to take the taxi drivers carrying those MPs and peers to the Parliament. The embankment is a slightly odd road. It is the only major road in London, apart from the Royal Parks, that is not also a bus route. That's because it's not particularly a destination. There aren't a lot of places along the embankment people want to get to. It is mostly a bypass for the city and the West End, and that's why it is very heavily used by cycle commuters during the morning and the evening rush hour, but it's actually relatively underused during the day when all those taxis and all those vans want to get around. You do not get those same criticisms being levelled at the north-south superhighways or any of the other superhighways in London. It's specifically an issue to do with the east-west one, and it's for all the same reasons that it's not a bus route, that those are specific criticisms that get levelled at the embankment cycle route and not the other superhighways. So, it is a bit of an exception, and anyway, it's a short-term problem, not a long-term. It's part of the long-term solution. So, what do we want to see happen in the government air quality strategy? Well, I will echo quite a lot of what Bridget said. Firstly, it is utterly unhelpful that the NO2 reduction plan, as the government eventually styled it, has not helped local authorities to implement charging clean air zones. The government needs to step in and provide political coordination and indeed technological coordination, because to leave it to local authorities to make the political case and to have all the and to sort of say, well, actually the assumption is that you shouldn't have to do this, is both contrary to the evidence that Bridget's also alluded to, that actually charging is a highly cost-effective way of reallocating road space, of both creating a disincentive to travel by motor vehicle and a positive incentive and an income stream to invest in the alternatives. So that's the key point about charging. What we also want to see in clean air zones is that this should be a political opportunity for the government to support its own cycling and walking investment strategy, which we and our allies at Sustrans and British Cycling, Living Streets, the Pedestrians Association all campaigned for there to be a cycling walking investment strategy, and it's ended up with very little investment and not a lot of strategy either. One of the big missed tricks was that for all that they have now, one of the best bits of the cycling and walking investment strategy is they've asked but not required local authorities to develop these local cycling and walking infrastructure plans. In essence, that is basically saying to local authorities, please draw up a network of cycle routes. And the emphasis on networks is quite an important thing, because in the UK, we've tended to plan individual cycle facilities in isolation where there was a bit of spare space and a bit of spare cash. The idea of network planning is what the Dutch have been doing for 40 years, but we've only kind of just cottoned onto it in UK transport policy. The Welsh got there first, actually. The English have just cottoned onto it with this LSWIP idea. So LSWIPs are something that local authorities in England are being asked to do. Actually, it should be a requirement in clean air zones. And it should also be a requirement that local authorities take on another policy of government, which is also a very good policy, but it's only a kind of something that local authorities are being asked to do, which is called cycle proofing. Making sure you take every opportunity to think about whether you could design cycle provision into not just things that are called cycle schemes, but any highway or traffic management scheme, and indeed every planning application, every new development, and indeed every highway planned road maintenance works. Every time you're resurfacing a road carriageway, that's an opportunity to think, could it be redesigned to be more cycle-friendly while you're at it? All of that comes under this heading of cycle proofing, and that should be part of any clean air zone that should be a part of the policy. Scrappage schemes. Yes, we're wholly in favour of scrappage schemes. The question then is who pays for it. It shouldn't be coming out of the local authorities' revenue streams from charging. Actually, it should be coming from VED, because that would raise the money from the motor manufacturers who are most responsible for causing the problem. If they don't switch to clean cars quickly, they will end up paying that. This will be a premium on the cost of their motor vehicles. So this would provide an incentive for the motor vehicles for the motor manufacturers to clean up the vehicle fleet, and the thresholds for charging VED could be lowered over time so that we progressively drive out the most polluting vehicles, whilst providing an income stream that government can coordinate for people to then trade in the most dirty vehicles. And that threshold too could shift over time. So we target the most dirty vehicles first, and we gradually take the dirty vehicles out of the motor vehicle fleet. However, in the longer term, VED isn't the right form of taxation, because it's actually a tax on vehicle ownership rather than on vehicle use. Over time, we should be shifting in the opposite direction, not least because of something that got picked up by a report from the think tank Policy Exchange, which is that if we are successful in decarbonising or electrifying our motor vehicle fleet, as the Committee on Climate Change expects us to be, and they are more optimistic than the Department of Transport, which is interesting in its own right, if the CCC is correct in their estimates, then the Treasury is going to end up with a black hole of between 9 and 23 billion by 2030. So we need an additional revenue stream, as well as an incentive for people to get out of their cars, and as well as providing a revenue stream for local authorities to invest in the sustainable transport alternatives. So over time, we should be shifting from VED towards road user charging in various forms. And the sooner local authorities have the tools to start that process, particularly in the urban areas where pollution is most acute, the better. The sooner we will get on with tackling NO2 emissions as quickly as possible as the law requires. The other 2 points I've got in there are we should be backing e-bikes, electric pedal cycles. It is nonsensical that the government's Office for Low Emissions Vehicles, OLEV, the OLEV, is putting in huge subsidies for electric motor vehicles. We fully support electric motor vehicles. We want to see electric motor vehicles, and the more of them that are in car sharing clubs that Bridget rightly mentioned, the better. But again, if we merely subsidise electric four-wheeled or vehicles with four wheels or more, then we're back to that earlier problem. We're tackling a quarter of a problem, not all of it, because we're missing the opportunities to tackle congestion, road danger, and physical inactivity. And finally, we need this whole thing to be backed up by a shift of funding from the massive and growing roads investment strategy, 15.2 billion over the 5-year period we're now in, and the government is talking about a much bigger second roads investment strategy. Meanwhile, that cycling walking investment strategy, the government's contribution to that is currently a little over £2 per person per year outside London, and that's set to decline to about 72p per person in 4 years' time. We are going in, funding-wise, we are still going in the wrong direction, and that needs to be reversed if local authorities are to have the tools to really promote public health, not just by cleaning up our air, but by getting us more physically active too, and also by reducing road danger and by improving our quality of life, by making our cities function, our towns and cities function in a safer and more attractive way. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. And last but by no means least, in the Chartered Institute of Environmental Health, the environmental health practitioner, Matt Clark. So, Matt, the floor's yours.
Hello, thanks for the invite, and hello to everybody here and at home. What is there to add, you may ask, after 3 quite comprehensive speeches going into a lot of detail there? I'm going to give you a local authority perspective. Slides are a bit wordy, so apologies for that. I'm from Shropshire Council, a rural authority. You may think, why does the local authority that's so rural have an air quality interest? Well, in Shropshire alone, we currently have 4 air quality management areas, and there's potentially the need for a couple more. I am, however, not going to speak on behalf of Shropshire Council, it must be said. I've been told very, very clearly I should make that statement, but some of the views have been my own, some have been gleaned from other local authorities. I thought I'd start with a brief kind of warm-up to where we are and how we've got here. How in 2017, in a developed country like the UK, are we talking about a public health emergency in something that's a basic requirement for life? It seems absolutely absurd. And why are we talking about it at all? How come we've got to a point where everybody is talking about air quality and people on the street that you bump into may well have a newspaper with it on the front page? The last 20 years or so, we've had the local air quality management regime, and that's been for local authorities to review and assess air quality in their patch. This has been very successful in providing us with an idea of where air quality problems exist and the extent of the problem. But more recently, 7 years ago, I think something that's really made air quality hit the headlines was the Compaign report, which I know Jim mentioned and referenced earlier, that 29,000 annual deaths attributed to PM2.5s. And from there, we've seen more instances of headlines. 2 years ago, Client Earth taking the UK government to court and to task, really, taking the Supreme Court over their current plans and inactivity. And the Supreme Court came back with a decision to say immediate action is required from the government. And here we are 2 years later with the immediate action. But in between that time, we had the Royal College of Physicians report with the 40,000 attributable deaths headline. Again, these big figures, Jim very neatly put it, that they're quite hard to imagine until you break them down, but they've helped by being headline grabbers, and it has helped, certainly from a practitioner perspective, to know that people from local residents and people from local estates are coming forward asking questions of the council. What are you doing about air quality? And if I look at the amount of requests I've had for information from individual residents this year compared to just last year, I think I'm probably already, we're only in September, I've probably had 7 or 8 times more requests this year than last year. So it's certainly all this impact, all these figures have helped solidify air quality in the public consciousness. I'm going to go on to a few perceived positives of the plan. First one, it does at least recognise the need for strong national leadership. Whether or not we'll get that will be seen. I'm slightly doubtful looking through the documents provided to at this point, but at least it does recognise that there is a need for it. And it states it not only in the detailed report, but also in the overview. So they've put it out there that they've nailed their colours to the mast. They are going to provide some strong leadership. And if we don't get it, I think we can point to the document to say that we need it and we've been promised it. Another point to note is that it seems simplistic, but it's an acceptance that road vehicles are the biggest contributor. And it's brought out there's some great graphics in the report which highlight this. That's very useful to someone like myself who works in environmental health when I'm going forward to transport colleagues or planners or people in public health or portfolio holders of those areas. It takes away some of the argument that sometimes comes back which says, well, it's not just transport, it's other things as well. But quite clearly the report states 80% is from transport, so we need to do something about the majority of the problem, not the fifth that's left behind. It has recognised that we had some disconnect in the past between agendas. So the CO2 agenda and the dieselisation of the current fleet to try and resolve the CO2 agenda has come at the price of an increase in nitrogen dioxide, or at least not the decrease we were expecting. So it has recognised that, it's recognised the link, and hopefully that will mean that going forwards, links will be recognised and maybe the pitfalls will be negated. And finally, it's a bit of a negative turned on its head. This was from a colleague actually gave me this one, that years and years of poor planning by central government have resulted in this cascade of information being brought to the fore, and local media, not just newspapers, but also local and national radio and television, talking about air quality. This has put air quality in the public's consciousness, and that can only be a good thing moving forwards, because we're then trying to, from a local authority perspective, trying to bring into or put forwards interventions which may be slightly unpalatable to certain people, certain businesses or residents, at least if they know that what it is for might just help us get things through. Now moving on, you can tell I'm not a politician who you'd never see use the word negatives, but there are a few negatives in the report, and I'll whiz through them to give us time for questions. Firstly, the report makes it very clear that it's a localised problem for local authorities to deal with. However, to me, a localised problem, if it was such a thing, wouldn't be occurring in over 200 places around the UK. You might have a dozen, you might have a 2 dozen, but over 200 air quality management areas, 4 for nitrogen dioxide in rural Shropshire. I mean, it seems really that this is a national issue that manifests itself locally, and therefore the national issue needs to be addressed, and national central government need to stand up and be counted and get involved here, and not just pass the buck down to local authorities, which is what a lot of local authorities do feel like is happening. And you can't blame them when you read the document. The funding focus, very quick one to highlight a point here. Highways England have been provided with 100 million to try and bring about air quality betterments. Fantastic. It's nice to see some big numbers. However, it's a local authority problem, this, that we've been told from the papers. £11 million is what local authorities have been given in grants, direct grants for air quality in the last 7 years. The last 7 years. And often they've been oversubscribed, you know, 4 to 1 for every pound. So people, local authorities, have been actively shouting out for help, provide us with the resources to take this problem on. The funding just hasn't been there. Taking a focus from an individual local authority could mean that we get an uncoordinated and or inconsistent approach. That's with the best will in the world. Lots of local authorities work together very successfully with their neighbouring authorities and in kind of agglomerations. But there's always someone that's at the edge of an agglomeration that may be impacted. And I'll give a couple of examples very quickly. The introduction of clean air zones, fantastic. But if you imagine the ring of the inside of a ring donut as the CAS, and then think about the surrounding donut, the actual meat of it, the donut. This is a kind of buffer zone around the CAS, you could say. The government's report, actually in the detailed response, talks about how people might go about reacting to changes and reacting to a CAS. And one of the things it says is that a certain proportion of people will simply avoid the CAS. So where do they go? They'll drive around the CAS. This is going to put not only potentially more vehicles onto those roads, but potentially the worst polluters. So it could compound existing problems for other authorities on the fringe of CASs to be. Taxi licensing is another example here. It was deregulated, the taxi trade, in 2015 to a certain extent, meaning that you can drive your taxi and collect fares in one authority and have your taxi licensed in another. You may say that's great for business, but what about a local authority that's been thinking about taxis as being part of the problem? Taxis do a lot of their driving in town centres. I'm not picking on taxis, by the way, particularly, but they tend to be taking people either from or to town centre locations. So it'd be quite reasonable for a local authority to think we'll use the powers that we have to introduce a policy to improve the emissions or ask for age limits on taxis. All well and good until the taxi that can't now get regulated, get a licence in one place, can just go to the neighbouring authority and get licensed there. A lack of detail, a plan for a plan, has been mentioned 1, 2, 3, 4 times now, and I think it's worth saying 4 times. This really isn't a document with lots of detail, even given the fact it has a couple of 100 pages in a detailed so-called report. And it still has a bit of a focus on planning and feasibility rather than the actual doing the do. There's no strategic infrastructure provision for alternative fuels marked out in this document. It talks about the Highways England, I think it is, having in future 95% of its roads covered by electric charging points, with a charging point every 20 miles. And there'll be rapid charges wherever possible. Fantastic. But there's more road that's non-Highways England in England than there is Highways England road. And also, there's no plan of where are these actually going to be? Where are the first ones going to be? Because early adopters of technology want to know now, if I'm going to go and buy an electric car tomorrow, I want to know I can charge it up either on my commute to work or on my usual drives without a map that tells me there's going to be one here in 6 months, 12 months. It seems like it's, again, a plan for a plan rather than a plan for action. Finally here, we've mentioned on the previous slide, for positives, a link between NO2 and the carbon agenda. That's fantastic, but I think Roger mentioned there was some missing links. Don't want to look at air quality on its own. We haven't picked up on PMs. This is a nitrogen dioxide issue here, not a PMs issue. And when we look at that 40,000 deaths and consider that 29,000 of them may be associated to particulates, and that's just PM2.5s, never mind the slightly larger ones, are we missing a trick? And I'd suggest, yes, we are. And furthermore, a sustainability agenda on the whole. We're not getting linked in where we should. There's hardly any talk of the planning regime in all of this. And I think it personally is central. Final slide, I promise. Is NO2 being considered a priority in the UK? You would think that it surely must be by now. We've had 20 years of LAQM regime. We've got all these huge numbers of attributable deaths being bandied around. So is it really being looked at as a priority? Well, the UK government have said we can see conventional fuels phased out for cars by 2040. Fantastic. Remember the headlines when that came out? Oh, it's far too soon. Oh, it's far too late. Well, actually, India planned for 2030. So how much of a priority does central government see NO2 as? And therefore, what are they passing down to local authorities for us to be able to use? To me, it seems that central government, with these kind of figures, are telling local authorities, it's all right, it'll all be fine, it might go away, just show willing, and we'll move past this, Brexit in a couple of years, and we won't get the big fines from Europe, and, you know, we're probably not going to come down on you. Well, it's not, doesn't sit well with me. It doesn't sit well, I don't think, with a lot of local authorities who have the health and well-being of their resident population at heart. That's why a lot of us go in to work for local authorities. It's not for us, it's for the folks in the communities. I did mention it earlier, but the planning regime, which seems, it's mentioned, it's a very light touch mentioned in the document, but it doesn't seem to me like there's a great driver here from central government saying, what are we going to do for our future development? Why are we not making every development fit for future, fit for electric vehicles, been mentioned, fit for cycle networks? Why isn't every bit of green space being looked as a connective green corridor for ecology purposes, as well as a connective green corridor that's really nice to go and cycle and walk down, which connects you to the next estate, which does the same, and so on and so forth? Fragmentation is a problem already mentioned, and we can address this through the planning system. But local authorities need a central government steer from this so that they don't get stamped down by developers who just say, no, we want the green space over here, please, and we're not very interested in putting in the cycle network. This was a perfect opportunity in this plan, I feel, for really stating how integral the planning regime can be to resolving or being part of the resolution to the problem. And it's been a trick missed. And that is me. Done.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, all of you, for some really thought-provoking comments and raising a whole series of key issues. I think it's appropriate for me to say exactly where the Chartered Institute of Environmental Health sits in relation to the NO2 plan. And that is to say everything you've said, basically. It is a weak plan for a plan. It is inappropriate, it is ineffectual. I could use stronger language. It is the way it passes the buck to local authorities is shameful. This is a national emergency requiring a national response from a national government, and for government just across the water over there to effectively just turn around and say, local authorities, you sort it out. You come to us in 2018 and tell us what your plans are for resolving this, frankly, is unacceptable. And government should be held to account by all of us, by all the citizens of the UK, in relation to that. And we should remember that next time we have an opportunity to vote. Now, at that point, can we throw open, please, the discussion opportunities and take questions from people in the room. If you're in the room, and then we will come to colleagues who are online, but if you're in the room, please raise your hand if you wish to ask a question of our panel. If you wish to make a statement, that's fine. But raise your hand. Tamara is at the back. We'll bring a microphone to you. It's important that we capture what you say because we do want people online to hear it, and we're recording this and it will go up on YouTube later. So it's important that we capture what you say. So over to you, colleagues. You've got an opportunity now. The floor is yours. Sian, in red.
Sian Buckley from the University of West of England. We didn't set this up. But I'm really interested about this idea of like an integrated transport policy. And how on earth are we going to even try and achieve that when we have private corporations who actually manage a lot of those systems, and that they are looking at economic opportunities with what they deliver rather than protecting perhaps public health? That's to all of you, actually, I suppose. Thank
Who
you.
would like to start with that? Roger?
Shall I do
Or
a
Matt?
quick start? Is that okay? It nicely follows on, I suppose, from the last point that I made of the planning regime, from a local authority perspective, that local authorities not only look at the individual dwellings and developments being put forward, but they look at their spatial planning as a whole. And I think it's very important that when those master plans are being drawn up, when spatial development plans are being looked at, that these networks are considered and that they are seen as a positive and indeed really a must-do for incorporation into a development. And in that way, development can be positioned where it can be most integrated into existing and where it can fit the needs of the population best. So we get development in the right places for the right reasons, for the right connectivity reasons. And while doing that, you can make so many other benefits from it with your greening and corridors and things as well. And it links in nicely to probably the next speaker's going to jump in. Is it going to be you, Roger?
I'm happy to crack in, because I wanted to pick up on sort of a more political answer rather than a policy answer. I mean, I think that's a very good policy answer, and I absolutely agree with it. But I think I sense that your question was actually related to some of what Jim was saying in the outset about political will. Now, it's all very easy, both for campaigners such as myself and indeed for local authority practitioners faced with a problem like us to sort of say, where is the political will from the national level, and wring our hands and all the rest of it. Actually, I want to be more positive than that, because I think that we will see some political will from some of the city leaders. I think that the local politicians are going to get this before national government does. And particularly we've now got metro mayors who have, a lot of whom stood on platforms saying that they would tackle air quality, and that those metro mayors have come from have ended up being a cross-political group. And I'm actually very heartened that we've had very strong commitments to sport walking and cycling on air quality grounds, as well as congestion and all the rest of it, from Andy Burnham, from in Greater Manchester, and indeed from Andy Street in the West Midlands, as well as other metro mayors. But those two are the most prominent, and they form effectively a cross-party group that can really help to mobilise around whom I hope other local authorities can rally, and that we can work together with organisations such as, not just Campaign for Better Transport, but with organisations like the Urban Transport Group, which represents some of those city authorities, to make the case that I touched on in that slide, that there needs to be a reallocation of overall transport funding from the National Road Scheme to local transport. And I'm not going to make that in a mode-specific way to say it's all got to go to cycling, walking, because it's absolutely right that it goes to electric cars and it goes to public transport and to city car clubs, that, as you rightly described, as an integrated transport solution. And we absolutely, Cycling UK absolutely see cycling as part of a wider integrated transport package that includes all the planning issues that other speakers have talked about. The political will, I think, is going to come from those cities, and then it'll spread outwards over time if all goes well. So that's my more optimistic view than you might expect me to otherwise take.
Thanks, Roger. Jim?
I will, if that's... Yeah.
Come after you, that's fine.
Okay, so yes, integrated transport, the great hope that we will act in a coordinated, coherent, systemic way. And we have to hold that hope, despite all the evidence that we think in very narrowly constrained ways when we actually implement or design policy. Now, just to put it back in an air quality context for a second, air pollution is essentially a function of those land use, transport planning and economic development decisions made at a whole range of scales, from the global all the way down to the local. And we live with the consequence of past decisions. So whether we like it or not, we're going to have a play out of the consequences of those, which frankly are made in the way that you described, with narrow economic decision making driving the way in which society will experience benefits and disbenefits. So where we are is somewhere where we should have hope, and the hope I give is thinking through the Global Sustainable Development Goals as a way in which we can think more systemically about solutions to these meta problems. They're really thorny, they're really difficult. I'm sure nobody actually sets out to cause air pollution problems. They just emerge as a consequence of those other decisions. So we need to think in a more integrated way at the policy design step. Decision makers who actually sign the checks to enable it to happen need to have the courage to say, hang on, we haven't thought about this in that truly integrated way. And I'm hopeful that we will see progress. I have to say the last 20 years doesn't give me a lot of hope, but I'm an optimistic individual.
Thank you, Jim. Before I come on to Bridget, if you're watching at home and you want to pose a question, I've got some questions coming in already, but just an encouragement for you to think about your question and type it in, and we'll get it put to the panel in due course. So that's just a plea, if you like, to those of you at home. Feel free, ask questions. Bridget.
Yeah, I think part of the answer to your question, and without repeating what others have said, is what I think George Bush called the vision thing. And not normally someone I would advocate looking to. I think if you look at the Mayor of London's transport strategy, it's currently out for consultation on the same time frame as the environmental strategy and the land use planning strategy, which I think is sensible in itself. He's or his very able staff have set out a vision for the kind of London, the kind of place they want to be, and then from that said, therefore, we need these kinds of planning and transport policies to get there. So if you buy into the vision, you buy into the destination, then you have to buy into the means to get there, even if some of those solutions might have been instantly less attractive than others. I think it's absolutely vital to bring together land use and transport planning. You can't really do one without the other. And there's a lot of opportunities from doing that, and opportunities to deliver things that maybe people aren't already persuaded by the four opportunity areas, policy areas that Roger outlined around public health and environment and so on, but perhaps have a more social economic agenda. There are wins for them as well, and I've just jotted down some of them. It makes it easy to deliver affordable homes if you bring transport and land use planning together, because if you allocate less expensive building land for parking, for homes for vehicles, you have more room to deliver homes for people. And not only do you have more of them, but there are more of them are likely to be affordable. That also helps you protect your green belt. We know a lot of your colleagues in planning and local authorities have huge battles on their hands to identify the sites needed for homes. If you do urban intensification instead of green belt, that, of course some people won't like it, but it's much more politically deliverable. You also, and Roger's got the stats on this, people who arrive by public transport, walking and cycling are much more likely to shop locally and spend more locally. It's a bit of a myth it's somehow easier to shop if you drive to a superstore. You probably end up walking further across the car park than you would walking up and down the high street. But that's the perception. But if you could incentivise people to shop locally, that has huge social and economic benefits. And it goes with the trend. Millennials, young people, are increasingly not getting driving licences and not buying cars. Now, that might not be a positive choice. It might be they're spending all their money on rent, and that's so they can't afford to. But that's the way things are going. So this is going with the grain. And then you've got new mobility as a service, smart apps. Fantastic one in Reading, where your smart card, which you get as a member of the car club, also lets you travel on the local buses. This is the kind of joined-up thinking that young people take for granted and want to see. And so there are attractive ways to deliver these policies, as well as the old sort of figure-wagging, it's good for your health.
Thank you. Comment that's come in from Roger Wilde. Roger says that why is there such little media coverage, particularly of particulate matter? And I would echo with that one. I was teaching air quality and environmental protection 20 years ago, and at that time talking about the potent dockery, six cities studies from the US that was talking about particulate matter being a mutagenic carcinogen, for which there was no safe level, and that was 20 odd years ago. So yeah, why is there such little media coverage? But interestingly, Roger then goes on to say, if particulate matter is as harmful as the experts say, then surely the only meaningful method of reducing pollution in our cities is to drastically reduce the number of vehicle journeys. People, he says, should be encouraged to work from home. Commuting is a nonsense, says Roger. And that pretty much is a statement, not so much a question, but it's a statement there from Roger. Other questions in the room before I take yeah. Lady at the back there. Thank you.
Thank you. Samantha Heath from London Sustainability Exchange. I don't want to be too London-centred, though, in my question, because London has ignored the national policy framework in relation to, it doesn't have to be sustainable, it doesn't have to be economically viable. It has ignored it in a number of visions in its environmental performance. So what help can we give local authorities who are being hamstrung by the national policy framework? I do understand that it's up for a review this December. There was last time when it came out about not being economic, there was a huge hue and cry, but the government didn't hear. So what support can we do to make sure that any future national policy framework can be more sustainable? And the second thing is, on my not being too London-centric, I am completely aware of the Fair Fuel bandit lobby, and people who are outside cities own most of the cars and do most of the journeying. So I'm very pleased that Matt's here to talk about a non-city perspective. But all the people that are writing to me angrily are saying, I need to drive to London. And now that's all very well, but they're making pollution in London, and it's not just London. There's some lovely examples in other parts. But what can we do to fight the fair fuel tax people? Because I think we've really got to fight that. We've had a really easy run. Pollution's had an easy run for the last few years, and I think we're going to now hit a very bumpy ride.
Anybody like to come back on that one? Roger?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you're right to point to the fair fuel lobby, and I think we've also got to point to the support it gets from a particular section of the media. And I've already touched on the Daily Mail as stirring up perverse counter arguments about cycle facilities causing congestion and pollution. It'll be the same sections of the media that will manufacture this idea that there is massive public opposition to 20 mph speed limits and cameras, and massive opposition to any kind of action on climate change, when in fact all of the public opinion evidence suggests the opposite. And of course, it's probably the same. In fact, it's often the same academics, and I put inverted commas around that, who argued that smoking wasn't going to damage health. It's actually the same political phenomenon time and time again. It keeps reasserting itself. We're going to have to be very clear that there is not only good evidence, but also good public support for the kind of things that we're all talking about in this room. There is very strong support for a greater investment in cycling. There is strong support for policies to reduce road traffic, even though people will feel some inconvenience in their own lives. People do resent the loss of parking spaces, but they are not opposed to sustainable transport policies, to the reallocation of road space. If we concentrate on the allocation of road space, actually that is mostly popular. There will be a 15 to 20% segment of public opinion that will oppose it, and that'll get fanned by the likes of the Daily Mail. Let's not kid ourselves that is majority public opinion. It's not. It's just what the Daily Mail wants to make out the public opinion's at.
Okay. Jim?
Yeah, I sympathise. It's real. It can be quite vicious in support of what is called a fair fuel lobby. But what actually are the views of those who are affected by the consequences of those actions? And what I'm holding up is a postcard we're using as part of an information process in a project we're running, funded by the European Union under Horizon 2020. This is the Clare City project, which is asking citizens across Europe what they actually want for their city. And what we're getting is a very positive message that aligns with the things that you've just been saying, Roger, that are about the type of city, about the type of life people want to live. And so there is a real groundswell of opinion in favour of the changes that we've been discussing this evening, and a sense that actually we want these things to come forward. Every time there are new initiatives, there are those who are the naysayers who will react against it. Actually, public opinion needs to be mobilised to say, actually, this is what we want. So we have to look at the ways in which we mobilise such opinion and use it to counter the quite vicious and often ill-informed arguments that are used for very narrow sectional interest.
I'm going to put a question that's come in online from one of our colleagues at home. And this is from Sean. Don't know where you are, Sean. You didn't put where you are. Doesn't matter. And it's just a quick response, please, from those in the panel. You'll like this one. What are the panel's views on the role of organisations such as Client Earth in bringing about change? Who would you like to begin? Bridget, would you like to start on that?
Absolutely. I'm a huge fan of Client Earth. I mean, they are our allies again in the Healthy Air campaign and the Campaign for a Clean Air Act. And I think their action on two fronts has been amazing. Very sort of inside track, using the mechanisms of power by taking legal action, something that they were uniquely qualified to do, and forcing those plans, inadequate as they are, to come out of government. But also fantastic, really effective, popular media campaigns. And one that I commend to you if you haven't seen it, which is the Polluted Playgrounds campaign. I'm not sure if it applies outside London. Apologies, but the principles are evident, and it's a very effective video that shows kids doing things kids do, running around a playground, chatting, kicking a football around, but they're wearing World War II gas masks as they do it because they're in a polluted playground. People care about their kids' health even more than they care about their drive to work, and I think that's the most effective way to change hearts and minds. And Client Earth are definitely top of the league in doing that, and kudos to them.
Roger, this should be right up your street.
Agree completely. We too are members of the Healthy Air Coalition. In fact, my colleague Don Condolimore is right now speaking on a panel up in Birmingham alongside Andrea Lee from Client Earth about using legal challenges as part of a wider campaigning strategy. Different topic, but it's absolutely relevant. I mean, the way that has pitted, evidence against the government's policy in the High Court and created all those news stories and created all the stories about how we were already hit pollution level, our annual pollution limits within 8 days on Putney High Street. They've been fantastic. They've been not just legally savvy, but very kind of media savvy too. And that has really helped the wider cause no end.
I'm going to take another couple of questions from online, and they're similar, so I'm going to bracket them together, if I may. We've got a question from Leon, who's up in Middlesbrough, Leon K. Thanks, Leon. What's the answer to arterial routes where we're close to exceedances, but we want to avoid toll charges, congestion charges? And from Sarah Newman in Southwark, why has the government decided to limit their attention to the worst road corridors where road charging has been shown to raise revenue but not impact significantly on pollutant levels? So similar questions looking at issues of arterial roadways and charging. One looking at it to say, how can we avoid going down that line? And the other saying, in effect, are you not seeing, is charging not just a revenue raising method, then what we're going to do is shift the problem around? Matt.
I think on the first point with the arterial routes, particularly if someone's trying to avoid being over the objective levels, and if they are currently not above the objective levels, actually the future's probably looking pretty good as we go forward. So we're probably going to see reductions on those roads over time. May well be slow, but we should see reductions rather than increases. However, when we consider points well made, Tony I think made these about there being no real safe level for pollutants, just because something comes in at 38 micrograms as an annual average doesn't mean it's safe and it's all hunky-dory and fine. We should still be looking for action. In relation to what to do to avoid the tolls, that's a very good question. It's hard to, when you look at arterial roads, this is where we're trying to put traffic usually, and that's where a lot of people and authorities are looking to put roads, instead of on the little rat runs, through onto the main arteries. One solution can be to try and gate arterial roads, to try and gate off the pollution and keep the vehicles held back in an area where the pollution doesn't have an impact because there aren't any receptors close by. So this may be on the kind of outskirts of town, and then rather than just opening the floodgates and letting everything in it at the same time, have traffic controlling. So you might have heard of some of the signalling systems knocking about. So you've got scoot systems and mover systems. They're really smart technologies, and they can be used for gating. And this could be one way of avoiding a toll, adding a disincentive to car use, because it does snarl things up on the outskirts and costs people time. And it would also reduce the nitrogen dioxide and particulate and other pollutant levels in areas where it matters for health. And I think that it's important to bring it all back to health. That's why we're here. It's not just for compliance, or it shouldn't be all for compliance. It should be for health reasons. And on the second point, what was the second question? Just run it by me again.
It was about how do we avoid the issue of charges. But the other point was around saying, well, isn't charging just a revenue-raising measure that isn't going to solve the problem?
I think we've had colleagues on the panel here a better place to respond, but I'll piggyback off their previous comments by saying that in short, yes, it is a revenue stream that's gained, but it's a necessary way to deter people to generate the revenue that needs to be spent on other mechanisms which can divert traffic away from solely car use, which is most people's primary and only thought when they wake up in the morning of how they're going to get to work.
And Bridget?
I would just say it's got to be part of a joined up strategy. If you just put a toll on one road in town, then I think we can all anticipate what's going to happen, and it's not a sustainable solution. But having a joined up approach where all modes are planned for and priced fairly, not only in terms of environmental impacts, but in terms of the use they make of precious space. You know, they're not making land anymore. It's a rational and a fair approach. And what I found really interesting this year was, if you're not already familiar with it, have a go off and Google. Roger mentioned Policy Exchange earlier. A centre-right think tank's actually done some really interesting work in this area. They organised the Wolfson Prize this year, which is an economics prize sponsored by Lord Wolfson, and it looks at different topics. This year it looked at paying for roads. And all the entries, including one from the RAC Foundation and one from the AA, were about different forms of road pricing. Everyone knows it's coming. And the question is not really whether you do it, but how you do it, and how you make it fair and effective and acceptable. And I think that the Fair Fuel campaign, who we mentioned earlier, I think they really are an outlying group now from the mainstream of thinking, even from road motoring organisations. And although they have talked about this crowdsourced legal challenge, crowd-funded, they haven't got the funding to get it off the ground, and it's not clear what the legal basis for it would be anyway. So although they do make a lot of noise, I think, unlike 10, 15 years ago when they were blockading oil terminals, I think the world has moved on. And I shouldn't let them divert us. But yeah, we do think it has to be part of a joined-up strategy, otherwise you just divert the problem and it becomes an unpopular solution that isn't a solution, and that's the worst kind of public policy.
Thank you. Opportunity in the room for another question. Yes, right at the back.
Robbie Calvert from the Royal Town Planning Institute. So I want to talk a little bit about collaboration needed in local authorities to deal with air quality matters. I would argue that planners sit very centrally in a lot of these matters, and planning departments as well as transport departments and local authorities have received some of the largest cuts in local authority budgets out of any department, which has left a lot of planning departments that are very reactive, making fragmented decisions, allowing for economic growth without being able to take in environmental and social impacts of their decision making. When, as our institute, what we're advocating is proactive, plan-led departments. So where should resource sit in terms of dealing with this in local authorities, and how do we create more plan-led departments?
May I start?
By all means.
On this one. A few years ago, public health came back to local government, and it's a key player in moving forward any regime or any service that can potentially deliver big, real health gains to the population. And I think that getting involvement on a local basis, getting public health involved and the right people from public health involved to support and oversee a plan when it's going through and provide some of the assistance with resource, because they may have specialists or may be able to call upon specialists to come and get involved, to provide that proactive overview for you, can really help get the best out of a plan going forward and help to spread the burden of, because it is seen as a burden sometimes, of having to produce what is a really substantial plan. I sometimes think that people don't realise how hard it is to get a planning policy through in its entirety. There's a lot involved, and so calling on all of your consultees in transport, in environmental health, in public health, to comment early on in the process, I think is a very good way of trying to make sure that a plan can take into account public health and well-being for all. I'll pass it over.
Okay. Take one more comment from the panel, and then I've got, conscious of time, and I've got two cracking little questions right at the end.
Just on the funding for planning, I mean, you're absolutely right. Don't dispute a word you've said about both the importance and the challenge of delivering well-funded planning work. There may not be much money in cycling and walking, certainly not as much as we like. 60 million for the Access Fund is just derisory compared to some of the other funding streams. There is money in homes, new homes, from both the private sector and from government. And if some of that money can be used to fund not only the excellent important work the planning departments do, but use local plans, and I absolutely agree, getting local plan right is vital to deliver some of the joined up housing and transport and access to jobs policies that we're all talking about, then that would deliver maximum benefit. That's the macro level. At the micro level, I would just say, be creative about, and I know you're the experts on this, we're looking to you for guidance on how you use your 106 and your SIL money. And make sure that, there is advice out there. Stagecoach, the bus operators, have produced very useful guidance in how to design new housing estates so that they are bus accessible. Even if a bus route isn't funded from the beginning, don't build them so buses couldn't get in the future. Yeah. And there's lots of expertise out there if we can harness it.
Can I just say that it really is important to put public health into that planning process, and to isolate it out and think about it as an add-on later misses all the opportunities. So the local plan process that's running in numerous local authorities, it's absolutely critical that with whatever resources are available, those issues that are at the heart of public health are discussed right at the beginning, because it's very difficult to retrofit, and that's many of the problems that we're confronting now.
I just wonder whether when you talk rightly about collaboration, I just wonder there are so many different. I used that slide earlier where I sort of talked about there's injury reduction, there's public. There are three different dimensions of public health there. There's injury reduction, there's air quality, and there's physical activity, and there are professional institutions with interests of all of those. Actually, isn't there a case that we need to be aligning all of those professional institutions as well as all the academic support that we can muster behind behind this whole interface that sort of says, actually these agendas all actually align very closely.
Quick question from Michael, who's online. Don't know where Michael's from, but here it comes. Just short answers, please, to all of you. Why can't the motor industry sell a car that travels more than 150 miles before needing recharging?
Well, the technology is getting better all the time. Batteries are getting smaller and lighter. I think, you know, it's a question of supply and demand. You know, I think we see with other technology that once the market gets to a certain maturity, that the scale is there, costs come down. But I think a lot of it's about certainty. A lot of vehicle buying is by fleets these days, both public sector and private sector. More and more people are leasing cars, around buying them. And, you know, big fleet buyers, whether it's an Addison Lee or a public entity, won't want to go electric unless they're certain that the charging network is there to support it. So it takes two to tango.
Roger, and then Jim.
I'm going to talk about, well, actually they could be selling things, pedal cycles, which need where the engine just needs refuelling every few hours, and that's a very, very sustainable fuel source.
Thank you, Jim.
The technology is improving, and the distance travel per charge will get better and better. But I just want to put a little particulate matter comment in. Let's not forget that there are particulate emissions from road wear and brake wear associated with electric vehicles. Yeah. And we will still have a particle issue if we assume that we're just simply exchanging old petrol diesel type vehicle for new electric vehicle. We will still have all of the problems that we have. So individual personal mobility is not the solution in the long run. The road network simply cannot be expanded to provide that capacity, and we'd be absolutely stupid if we even tried. So we have to think very differently. We have to think about all of the things that colleagues have spoken about in their introductory comments. It's got to be a different future.
Matt, quick response.
Very quick response that you can buy one that does more than 100 miles. Now, I think I did look at one which is reckoned it would do about 200. I think it had to be on a particularly hot day, going downhill most of the time with a push start. But yeah, we are getting there. We're definitely getting there.
We do know Tesla will do.
If you look up the top 10 fastest cars in the world, a proportion of them are electric now.
Yeah.
If you look it up, just Google top 10 fastest cars in the world.
Yeah.
Quite a few of them are. And there's also every year there's an electric vehicle road trip, which is organised across Europe. Yeah, and they go across like 6 countries or something.
One final question, and I apologise to those in the room that want to ask. I know Will wanted to ask questions, but time has beaten us. This is the last one. It's from Dr. Stephen Battersby, and he says, if we accept that the government is showing inadequate leadership now on air pollution and the public health emergency that this is causing, what are the chances of stronger action when we've left the EU? And what can we do to prompt a change in attitude? Who'd like to begin with that poison chalice?
Okay, I'll pick up and try not to drink from the poison chalice. I have made my views about Brexit very clear. I think it is a lunatic position to adopt, and I'm very fearful for environmental protection measures post any UK move out of the European Union. Having said that, mobilising public opinion is the only way, and there are numerous ways in which we can and must do that. In the same way that we must mobilise public opinion to demand public health protection, we can look to ways to mobilise public opinion about an exit from Brexit, as some have called it.
Thank you.
I'm not going to comment on Brexit, although my personal views have been eloquently stated for me. What I would say is I think there are two strands. One is about making sure that we transpose as many of the environmental protections into UK law as possible. I commend you to the excellent work done by the Greener UK campaign run by Green Alliance, which is looking for maximum acquis of environmental protections. So at least they run on for longer until something better hopefully is in their place. The other thing is I would talk up the economic benefits potentially of this agenda. You know, there's a big, fewer cars, not just newer cars, is our slogan. But electrification is a vital part of the solution, particularly for those more remote areas who will always be vehicle dependent. And there is a big homegrown electric vehicle industry in the North East. So I would talk that up to people who aren't already persuaded by the green and the health agenda, that post-Brexit we need some good world-class homegrown industry, and electrification is part of that.
Roger?
I share some of your lack of optimism about political will coming from national government on this, but also on many other issues. You know, it's just completely consuming political attention. My optimism comes from the fact that I think, following on from Bridget's point, so much of the economics is just going to pull the other way in ways that are actually analogous to what's happening in electricity generation. It's not been green arguments that are shifting the sort of coal generation away, shifting power generation away from coal and towards renewables. It's economic arguments are beginning to win that one now, and over time that'll become the same for sort of dealing with, you know, faced with oil dependence is going to become an increasingly economically costly thing at the macroeconomic level. It's not going to make sense to carry on doing it. That'll win the argument over time. In the shorter term, I revert to my earlier point about it's actually the political will is going to come more from the city mayors than from national government.
Matt, finally.
Okay. On getting a stronger position, I think it's slim chance of that. Although there are commitments for central government to look at the sustainability agenda and reduce NOx and particulates and ozone and carbon over time, post 2030. However, we can be doing things now to try and make sure that we get a good legacy from the public opinion that's around us at the moment, and from the media coverage, and from great speakers like these that come along and talk to us and impart all of their knowledge. By using all of this to get air quality, or an air quality strand in sustainability running through our local authority policies, whether that's planning policies, whether that's your joint strategic needs assessment, transport policies, economic development strategies. Get them in now, and you should be able to see a legacy and run through it down the line, despite what happens if we no longer have the threat of big fines looming over us from Europe.
Tony, I thought of one other little point, if I may. Environment Secretary Michael Gove has been promising that this would be a government that would leave the environment better than it found it. We are expecting a 25-year environment strategy. Let's make sure we work together to take him at his word. And that's for the city authorities as well as our professional institutions or all our campaigning organisations. Let's take him at his word.
Thank you. At that point, everybody, whether you're here, whether you're at home, whether you're still sat at your office desk watching this online, thank you very much for taking part. I apologise to all those that sent in questions and I didn't get a chance to pose them. I particularly apologise to Linda Stefek up at Salford, who sent some cracking questions and we just couldn't get to them, and to Sarah Newman also for other cracking questions that have come in, and to a whole host of other people too. On behalf of everybody here at the Chartered Institute of Environmental Health, I'd like to thank Jim, Bridget, Roger, Matt for their time, for coming down here this afternoon and involving themselves in this, and particularly for their powerful rhetoric and powerful arguments that they put forward. Thank you all very, very much indeed. And I hope that those in the room will show that thanks in the normal manner. Thank you.